Tonight's presentation is one I've been looking forward to, and it's a part of the semester that I always look forward to. It's the conclusion of a 3-week trend in which we hear from Keene State's college students about their research. And today we're going to hear from 4 students, Katelyn, Vanessa, Megan, and Grace, who are honors research students in the Department of Psychology. To introduce these students, I want to introduce and give to the floor Professor Harlan Fichtenholz. He's an assistant professor in the psych program, been here since 2016. He's got a PhD from Duke, and he's got a BA from Oberlin. He's the coordinator of the neuroscience BA and BS programs here at Keene State, as well as teacher of the honors research seminar where these projects that you're going to hear about got their start and development. When the students are done with their presentations, I and Professor Fichtenholz will join the webinar to help with questions, and I'll help close us out. But until then, I give the floor to my colleague, Professor Fichtenholz.
All right, thanks, Mike. So I just want to say that these are 4 students who worked incredibly hard over the past year and a half, developing and implementing these independent projects with the help of great faculty in our department, as well as a couple faculty from other departments who've joined in on review committees as well. And I wanted to thank all those faculty for their hard work in guiding these students through the process. So we're going to have them go sort of back to back, give their presentations and have all the questions at the end, just so we can make sure that everyone gets a fair amount of time to get through their presentation. So I'll give you all their titles now, and then we'll get started. So first, we're going to have Vanessa Nichols, who's going to tell us about the development of a substance use risk potential scale for emerging adults that she developed over the past year and a half. That'll be followed by Megan Marshall, who did a project on the effects of trauma and resilience on stress reactivity. Third will be Grace Vogel, telling us about the effects of stimulus and response distance on decision making. And last but not least will be Katie Pacheco, giving us a talk about how parenting impacts narcissism. So with that said, just to make sure we get everybody in, I'm going to go ahead and turn the screen over to Vanessa, and we'll get underway.
Okay, so let me just share my screen really quick. Okay, so let me do this too, sorry. All right, so for my for my honors project, I decided to try to develop a substance use risk potential scale for emerging adults. So to start, I'm going to explain why I thought it was necessary to create this scale. So first off, as almost everyone knows, we're in the middle of a drug crisis. Almost everybody can say that they know somebody at this point that's been directly affected or has had family or friends that have been affected by the drug crisis. A new issue, though, is that it's affecting younger and younger populations. So in 2017, 5.1 million young adults ages 18 to 25 reported a problem with substance use. This is approximately 1 in 7 individuals. Also in 2017, 3.4 million young adults reported a problem with alcohol use disorder. 2.5 million young adults had an illicit drug use disorder, and heroin use among young adults between 18 and 25 have doubled in the past decade. So these trends suggest a rising epidemic of substance use in early adulthood. This warrants a more intensive effort to develop an assessment and treatment strategies for this age group. The second reason why I wanted to start developing a new scale is due to the results of this pilot study that I did with Dr. Scholey probably like a year and a half, 2 years ago. This pilot study was developed to further investigate the value of the substance use risk profile scale, which I refer to as the SERPs throughout this presentation, in predicting the substance use related problems. So I'll go into more detail about the SERPs in a little bit, but just briefly to say it's a 4-factor model. Its 4 factors are sensation seeking, impulsivity, hopelessness, and anxiety sensitivity. So in this pilot study, the outcome variables were frequency of use and MMPI addiction acknowledgement scale. We found that only 2 of the substance use risk profile subscales demonstrated a significant correlation with the MMPI. The subscales were sensation seeking and impulsivity. With respect to frequency of use, the only significant correlation was with the sensation seeking subscale of the SERPs. I was shocked by these results because only 2 out of the 4 subscales of the SERPs correlated with any frequency of use or addiction acknowledgement. Due to the pressing concerns that I talked about in the last slide, I felt like it was necessary to try to develop a better scale that focuses more on addictive behaviors. Which leads me to the focus of my current study. Our primary study was to create a new substance use potential scale for emerging adults and compare it with the well-known substance use risk profile scale, as well as demonstrate concurrent validity of the CompSU through substance use criteria. So just to give you a little bit more information on the substance use risk profile scale, because this is the scale I used to directly compare against the scale I created. The substance use profile scale, like I said, is a 4-factor model. It incorporates 4 traits associated with addiction vulnerability. The traits, once again, are anxiety sensitivity, sensation seeking, impulsivity, and hopelessness. The correlation between theoretically related SERP subscales and other measures range from a 0.56 to a 7.3. The predictive validity of the SERPs was modest. The issue with their research, though, is that they relied on college undergraduates who reported a minimum substance use. So this rendered some of the statistical analysis difficult to interpret. To talk about my scale, the scale I created is called the CompSU. The CompSU is a multidimensional scale consisting of 4 subscales associated with substance use. So my 4 subscales are sensation seeking, impulsivity, self-soothing defect, and hopelessness. This was a 2-stage study, and in stage 1, 48 items were developed. A factor analysis was performed to reduce the item set to 24, and a clear 4-factor solution was obtained. In phase 2, the concurrent validity of the CompSU was demonstrated through correlations with standard substance use criteria measures. So due to the similarities of the structures of the questionnaires, meaning I too used a 4-factor model and included sensation and impulsivity, I wanted to directly compare my sensation and impulsivity questions against the SERP sensation and impulsivity questions, which is what I did in the next couple slides. So this slide shows my CompSU sensation-seeking questions, and it also shows the SERP sensation-seeking questions. So for just an example of one of my questions, my question is, my life would be intolerable without a daily dose of excitement. And an example of the SERP sensation-seeking question is, I would like to skydive. I feel as though the SERP's sensation-seeking question did hit sensation-seeking, but I wanted to focus my questions more on addictive behavior. So that's what I tried to do. So this is an example of the CompSU impulsivity questions and the SERP's impulsivity questions. An example of the CompSU is, I get into trouble because I don't think before I act. An example of the SERPs is, genuinely, I'm an impulsive person. So once again, I just feel as though the SERPs is a more broad topic, and I really wanted to narrow my focus on addictive behavior specifically. So to move on to my methods for phase 1, a 48-item questionnaire was developed that included a 5-point Likert response format. A sample of 220 emerging adults was recruited from prolific academic, 110 of each gender, 18 to 30 years old, drawn from a larger sample of individuals who registered as actively engaged in substance use or recovery. The 48-item CompSU was reduced to 24 items through factor analysis. So I'm going to talk about my results for phase 1, which was my factor analysis. A factor analysis is a technique that is used to reduce a large number of variables into a fewer number of factors. So for my factor analysis, I did a principal component factor analysis with a Varimax rotation. I knew that I was going to have 4 factors from how I set up the questionnaire. So when I did it in SPSS, I put in my 4 factors. So my 4 factors are sensation seeking, impulsivity, self-soothing defect, and hopelessness. I only kept items with a loading of 0.4 or higher. And then I also ran Chromebox alpha for each individual factor and the total scale, which is right here. My Chromebox alphas were 0.7 or higher. So this concludes my results for phase 1, which moves me to my methods for phase 2. So a sample of 100 emerging adults was recruited online from Prolific Academic, 50 of each gender, 18 to 30 also, and they also actively engaged in substance use or recovery. Phase 2 was used to assess the concurrent validity of the CompSU. So we paired it with the MMPI addiction acknowledgement, frequency of use, readiness to change, and drug-related locus of control scale. The SERP sensation seeking and impulsivity scales were also included for direct comparison. So to start looking at my results for phase 2, I started with bivariate correlations. So what you can see from looking at this table is that I actually did not include the Rolnick's readiness to change questionnaire after all, because it did not significantly correlate with any of the CompSU factors or total scales, and also did not correlate with any of the SERPs factors or total scales. So just to break down this chart, I have my CompSU subscales and its total, and the SERP subscales and its total. And then I have my substance use criteria, which is the MMPI, drug-related locus of control, and frequency of use. As you can see, a lot correlated. The CompSU correlated with 13 out of the 15 possible, and the SERPs correlated with 7 out of the 9 possible. The CompSU did not correlate with the CompSU self-soothing deficiency did not correlate with drug-related locus of control or frequency of use, and the SERP sensation seeking did not correlate with the MMPI or drug-related locus of control. So I used these results to move on to my next analysis, which are partial correlations. So I ran a partial correlation for each one of my substance use criterias. So I have one for the MMPI, drug-related locus of control, and frequency of use. So to start with the MMPI, this table shows a stronger relationship between the CompSU and the MMPI as compared to the MMPI's relationship with the SERPs. So if we look at this table, I have the CompSU and the MMPI, and I control for SERPs. It's statistically significant, and it also has an explained variance of 8%. So explained variance can be thought of like in a Venn diagram where it overlaps. So what this is saying is that when I control for SERPs, the CompSU and the MMPI still overlap by 8%. But if we look at the SERPs and the MMPI's relationship once we control for CompSU, it's not statistically significant, and it only overlaps by 3%. So this table clearly shows that the CompSU and the MMPI have a stronger relationship as compared to the MMPI's relationship with the SERPs. Moving on to my next partial correlation was related to the drug-related locus of control scale. So this table also shows that the CompSU and the drug-related locus of control have a stronger relationship as compared to the drug-related locus of control's relationship with the SERPs. So if we look at the table once again, the CompSU and the drug-related locus of control controlling for SERPs is statistically significant with a 9% explained variance or overlap. But if we look at the SERPs and the drug-related locus of control's relationship, it's not statistically significant, and it's less than 1% explained variance or overlap. So this table clearly shows that, once again, the CompSU has a stronger relationship with the drug-related locus of control scale as compared to the SERPs relationship. My last partial correlation table is about frequency of use. So this table actually shows that the SERPs has a better relationship with the frequency of use as compared to the CompSU's relationship with frequency of use. So if we look at the table, the CompSU total and the frequency of use control for SERPs is not statistically significant, and it only has an overlap of 3%. But if we look at the SERPs and the frequency of use, it is statistically significant with an overlap of 5%. So this table does show that the SERPs and frequency of use have a strong relationship as compared to the partial correlation with the CompSU and the frequency of use. Overall findings from the partial correlations reveal that the CompSU has a stronger relationship with the MMPI and drug-related locus of control as compared to the SERPs, but that the SERPs has a stronger relationship with frequency of use. So the last statistical analysis I did was multiple regression analysis, and I did this to compare the predictabilities of the scales. So I started off with the CompSU total scale and the SERPs total scale. My substance use criteria remains the same. So I have the MMPI, drug-related locus of control, and frequency of use. When you look at the MMPI and drug-related locus of control, you can see that the CompSU is the stronger predictor. But if you look at frequency of use, the SERPs is the stronger predictor. I also ran stepwise regressions for all of these, and regarding the MMPI and drug-related locus of control, the CompSU was retained, but for frequency of use, the SERPs was retained. The next multiple regression analysis is a direct comparison of the impulsivity scales. So I have the CompSU impulsivity and the SERPs impulsivity. For this table, only the MMPI showed significant data. So for the MMPI, the SERPs impulsivity actually turned out to be the stronger predictor in this case, which is shown right here. I did run a stepwise regression as well, and the SERPs impulsivity was retained for the MMPI. My last multiple regression analysis was for sensation seeking. So I have the CompSU sensation seeking and the SERP sensation seeking. For this table, the two statistically significant points were for drug-related locus of control and for frequency of use. For both of these, the CompSU sensation seeking ended up being the stronger predictor. I did run stepwise regression once again, and the CompSU sensation seeking was retained for both of them. So when you look at these charts individually, it can be kind of confusing because in certain instances, the CompSU does better, in certain instances, the SERPs does better. But I think that when you look at them all together, it reveals that the CompSU is the better tool because it has a more flexible approach. The CompSU was able to predict all the outcomes at least once, while the SERPs was unable to do that. So if we look back, the CompSU was able to predict the MMPI and drug-related locus of control, and it was able to predict drug-related locus of control and frequency. The SERPs was only ever able to predict frequency of use and the MMPI. So to move on to my discussion, for phase 1, the internal 4-factor structure of the CompSU was demonstrated through factor analysis. For phase 2, the CompSU demonstrated concurrent validity by significantly correlating with the MMPI, drug-related locus of control, and frequency of use. Partial correlation analysis suggests a more robust relationship between addiction acknowledgement and control beliefs. The SERPs was a stronger relationship with substance use frequency. Overall findings suggest the CompSU may provide a more flexible tool for the assessment of multiple substance use criteria, from addiction awareness to control belief and frequency of use. For future research, the multidimensional nature of the CompSU could allow for future investigations of subtypes of at-risk emerging adults. So a subtype could look like a subtype of hopelessness or subtype of sensation seeking. Ultimately, these subtypes could possibly allow therapists or guidance counselors or teachers to focus on the specific desire that those people are trying to fill. By understanding why people are using or what they're aiming for, ultimately it may be possible to match risk profiles with tailored interventions. Also, a larger, more stratified sample will be required to develop CompSU norms. And lastly, my limitations. One of my main limitations was that I decided to only use 2 out of the 4 subscales for the SERPs. The reason I did that was because those 2, which was sensation seeking and impulsivity, were the only 2 that were statistically significant in the pilot data. In future studies, I might use all 4 at this point. Another limit comes from prolific academic. It was great using prolific academic because I was able to use people that had actually dealt with substance use or were dealing with substance use, but they mixed them together. In the future, I would rather look at people who are in active recovery, or I would rather look at people who are using but not a mixed sample. Another issue with prolific academic is that although it's a relatively diverse group, they're primarily from North America and Europe, so ultimately the CompSU will have to be tested in a more diverse population. So here are my references. And then I just want to say thank you to my committee, which is Dr. Smith, Dr. Scholey, Dr. Smith, and Dr. Clark. And thank you to Keene State College's Center for Creative Inquiry for funding this project. And also special thank you to Harlan because he was awesome the whole year. So, and then I think we're doing questions at the end. So that's it. Thank you. So I will stop sharing so that Megan can go.
All right. Hi, I'm Megan Marshall, and for the past 2 semesters, I've been working on my honors research project looking at the effects of trauma and resiliency on stress reactivity. So let's dive deeper into this understanding of this relationship. In a daily life, human stress response plays an important role on oftentimes benefiting an individual and other times causing maladaptive responses. Stress reactivity is categorized as a temperament, and that causes differences in psychological and physiological stress responses. There are many tests out there, such as the cold pressor test, the Trier social stress test, the Maastricht acute stress test, all of which measure stress reactivity. These tests produce stress responses that will have an effect on physiology, cognition, emotion, and behavior. For this project, I chose to look at the MAS task because of the fact that it looks at both physiological and social/mental stress induction. So according to previous research, there is a relationship between trauma exposure and resiliency, trauma exposure and anxiety, and resiliency and anxiety. The relationship between resiliency and anxiety is believed to be inversely related. The relationship between trauma and anxiety is known to be an associative symptom of trauma, whereas the relationship between resiliency and trauma is also believed to be an inverse relationship. Individuals that have high amounts of adverse experiences tend to have high amounts of resiliency, and the variation in individual trauma history and level of resiliency can influence an individual's reaction to stress. Therefore, stress reactivity is believed to be one of the underlying mechanisms that links trauma and physiological disorders such as anxiety. So let's dive deep into some of the methodology of this study. So my study included 215 Keene State undergrad students who there was 148 females, there were 62 males, and 5 non-binary. The average age was about 21 years of age, and the standard deviation was about 5. So informed consent was obtained from all participants, and each participant was entered into a raffle to win a gift card. Some of the exclusion criteria just included the fact that their age needed to be above 18 or above 18 years of age, and this study was approved by the Keene State IRB. So let's talk a little bit more about the task design. So the task design was laid out in a forum where the participant had an online forum where the participant had to fill out a demographic question, their resting heart rate, some questionnaires, and a stress reactivity task. The participants would start by filling out the demographic information. This would include things such as their age, their gender, and ethnicity. Then they would be asked to measure their heart rate, doing so manually. So they would place their index finger or third finger on their neck on the side of their windpipe, and they would feel for their pulse, and they would count the number of beats in 15 seconds. They would then be asked to multiply that number by 4 to calculate the beats per minute. Following that, they would fill out 3 questionnaires: the Hamilton Anxiety Questionnaire, the Brief Trauma Questionnaire, and the Connor-Davidson Resiliency Questionnaire. Finally, they would complete a 4-minute trial of counting backwards from 2043 by 17. The participants were asked to complete all of this on an online forum used by Psych Toolkit. Unfortunately, because of COVID-19 and limitations placed on by COVID-19, we were not able to do the in-person data collection, which included the cold pressor task section, so the more physiological section of the MAS task. So they only completed the mental arithmetic stress induction task. So here gives you a little bit of an insight onto what the participants had to look at. So this is taken exactly right from the online forum, And this gives you an idea of what the Hamilton Anxiety Scale looked like for them. So this scale was chosen out of all of the other type of anxiety type surveys because of the fact that it measures anxiety as a whole and not their current state. This is the Connor-Davidson Resiliency Scale. We chose this one just because of how good it is, and it just gets right to the point of resiliency. And again, this is kind of what the participants saw when they were doing this whole survey. And lastly, the brief trauma questionnaire. This was displayed a little bit differently just because of the format of the questions. Each question had their own type of format, so we needed to kind of make sure it had all of the components of each question. And we chose this questionnaire mainly because of the fact that it assesses an individual's trauma history rather than the specific trauma themselves. So let's, so here we're gonna see what it looked like for the counting backwards task. Again, it consisted of about 4-minute trial. So prior to this whole task, they would see an instruction page where it essentially just told them they needed to count backwards from 2043 by 17. And you'll see here this little blue box, that is where they would input the number. And so they were told in the instructions to continuously count down until the trial was up. And so this is kind of what it looked like. So they would enter the number. However, if the participant was wrong or correctly entered in a number, they were given a negative feedback slide saying you are wrong. So this is kind of what would pop up for them. So let's now talk about some of the results of this study. The results of the multinomial logistic regression revealed that resiliency and trauma and anxiety not to be statistically significant predictors of stress reactivity measured by the counting backward task. However, a separate multinomial regression revealed that resiliency and trauma were statistically significant predictors of anxiety. This significant predictor of anxiety revealed that there is an association between resiliency and trauma. And we also found that as age increased, the likelihood of having anxiety symptoms decreased. So there was a 25% decrease for mild, a 20% decrease for moderate, and a 29% decrease for severe anxiety. So let's look at some of the trauma history. So we found that participants with no trauma history were 89% less likely to have severe anxiety in comparisons to participants with 2 or more traumas. Participants who experienced a single trauma were 94% less likely to have mild anxiety, and 89% less likely to have moderate anxiety, and 90% less likely to have severe anxiety. All again in comparison to the 2 or more traumas. Now let's talk about some level of resiliency, where what we found was when looking at the level of resiliency, we can see having a low resiliency is a significant predictor for mild and moderate anxiety, with a 17% increase for mild anxiety and an exponentially greater increase for the moderate anxiety. So the results indicate that resiliency and trauma exposure are significant predictors of anxiety, however, not so much for stress reactivity. We conclude that there are potential limitations to this study, which include the fact that the mental arithmetic task was an online form, and it did not successfully create stress reactivity in comparison to previous studies and in-person versions. We hypothesized that this limitation might be due to the fact that participants had access to potential aids or calculators, and in previous studies, participants had to perform the mental arithmetic task in front of a researcher, therefore inducing more stress. And then there is my references. And I want to take the time to thank you all for coming out and to listening to my talk. I wanted to thank the CCI grant for making this project possible. I also want to thank my committee members, Dr. Viveros and Dr. Welkowitz. And I want to give a very special thanks to my mentor, Dr. Harlan Fichtenholz, for all of his wisdom, guidance, and support during this project and over the last 3 years. Thank you. And then questions, I believe, we're at the end.
So I believe it's my turn now. Give me just a second. Alrighty, so my name is Grace, and my study is on the effects of stimulus and response distance on decision making. So what is decision making? Well, it's basically the cognitive process resulting in the selection of a course of action among several possible alternative options. Scientists studying decision making are generally interested in understanding preferential choice and action, how people choose what action to take to achieve a goal, and what conflicts get in the way of this. The 4 main types of decision making include directive, conceptual, analytical, and behavioral. My study focuses on behavioral decision making. So I'm going to talk about 2 studies that we kind of combined to create the current study. The first one is a key placement study. So one study, well, this study tested the idea that people incorporate environmental structures such as spatial distance into their thought processes, and that by keeping your hands apart may keep things apart in your mind. So they used the Stroop task with response keys far apart in one block and close together in another. And just to make sure everyone knows, the Stroop task is a phenomenon that occurs when you are tasked to say the color of a word, but not the name of the word. So for this particular task, they were presented with either the word red, 4 X's, or blue, and they had to determine if the font color was red or blue. And what they found were that when response keys were close together, participants' response time and trial errors increased significantly. So it was harder to make a decision and make that decision accurately when the keys were close together. The second study that the current study is based on is the stimuli distance study. Scientists put together a study that would test how spatial distance changed the difficulty of making decisions, and participants were presented with 2 objects on a screen and were asked to choose which one they preferred. So the 2 topics were dessert options and writing utensil options, and they just picked which one they preferred. They measured response time, and they also asked participants how difficult the decision was to make after each trial. So when the objects were closer together, participants reported higher levels of difficulty when making a decision, and response time also increased when the trials had objects that were close together. So the current study combined the concepts of these 2 previous studies and looked into the effects of object distance and response key distance independently and their interactions. So we had 52 participants, 41 being female, with the average age being 21. It was conducted online, so everyone could do it on their own computers at home using SciToolkit. And everyone was recruited via email through the Keene State College database, and everyone was told they'd be entered into a raffle to win $10 in the form of an Amazon gift card, and there were 20 available. And all study procedures were reviewed and approved by the Keene State College IRB committee. So what exactly did the task look like? So participants were presented with 2 images of vacation destinations at the same time and were asked to choose which one they preferred. So the far key task had response keys A and apostrophe, and those were roughly 19 centimeters apart on the average keyboard. And the near key task had response keys G and J, and those were roughly 4 centimeters apart on the average keyboard, which is 21% of the far key task distance. And these keys were chosen because we wanted to mimic that same distance for the stimuli images on the screen. So both blocks had randomized 25 close together image pairs and 25 far apart image pairs for a total of 50 trials per block. No images were repeated twice, so they were new each time. And all images were 200 by 200 pixels. And the images were up for as long as the participant needed, but they were told to try to respond as quickly as possible. And response time was measured to determine difficulty of choice. So I'm going to show you just a quick example of what it would look like. So this would be the instructions that they would receive for the near key task with G and J, and what to press depending on which vacation destination they preferred. And then we can see this is what the far part stimuli looked like. And this is what the close together stimuli looked like. And then again, we see the same thing for the far apart key task. And again, far apart stimuli, close together stimuli, not in that specific order, it was randomized. So what did we find? The first thing that we found was that participants were more likely to press the left key than the right key. So the left key bias had a greater bias at 59% during the far key task compared to the near key task at 54%. The next thing that we looked at was key distance, and we see that the decision is less difficult to make during the near key task compared to the far key task. And in the near key task, they responded 171 milliseconds faster with an average of 1.67 seconds compared to the far key task, which was roughly 1.84 seconds. If we pull this apart even more, we can look at key distance in gender, and we see that men had no significant difference between task types, and they're in the red over here. But women found the decision less difficult to make during the near key task compared to the far key task. So they responded 130 milliseconds faster with an average of 1.59 seconds compared to the far key task for women, which was roughly 1.72 seconds, sorry. And the last thing that we looked at was stimuli distance in gender. So we see again that men had no significant difference between far stimuli and close stimuli. And again, they're in the red. And we see that women found the decision less difficult to make when stimuli were presented close together, responding 111 milliseconds faster. So we see the average response time for the near stimuli for women was 1.6 seconds, while the far stimuli was more like 1.71 seconds. So what can we take away from all of this? So first, previous studies did not find a left or right key bias in their data, but other researchers have found that handedness is just as influential as preferred stimulus. So this could be why I found a left key bias in my study. More people may have been left-handed. The second thing was that the results of the previous key placement study found near key distance to cause more difficulty in making a decision, yet the current findings contradict this. And the results from the previous stimuli distance study also contradict the current study's findings. As earlier, it was discussed that close stimuli distance made the decision more difficult. So why do we have the contradicting results? It could be due to the fact that we tested the two factors together, or that the study was done remotely and not in a controlled environment like a lab setting like it normally would be. And lastly, while previous studies did not find a difference in gender, the current study did. Women found the decision easier to make when the stimuli were close together and when the key distance was close together. Results on gender and decision-making are not conclusive within the research community, and their findings do vary. Some find no differences between genders, while others find that stress impacts genders differently or during decision-making. In the future, it would be helpful to get a more even ratio of gender to see if the results are similar, because I only had 11 men and 41 women. So I want to thank the Keene State College Center for Creative Inquiry for funding my honors research. And I'd like to give a special thanks to my mentor, Dr. Harlan Fichtenholz, for being a huge help this past year. And I would also like to thank my committees for their support throughout this past year. So Dr. Wolkowitz and Dr. Viveros. And here are all my references, and we'll be taking questions at the end. So thank you.
Hi, everybody. Give me just a second to get situated. All right. All right. So can everyone see? Okay. So what is narcissism and what are its origins? Can parenting shape future narcissistic tendencies in children? My name is Katie Pacheco, and I have been working alongside of Dr. Karen Jennings to investigate the relationship between parenting, narcissism, and gender. I'd also just like to say it's really wonderful to be here tonight, and thank you everyone for coming this evening to hear about the work that all four of us have been doing. It's just really a pleasure to be able to share this work with you all, so thank you. So to begin, we have to start with an understanding for what narcissism is. Narcissism falls along a continuum. There are healthy levels of narcissism that promote self-confidence and positive self-image, and there are also maladaptive forms of narcissism that can cause an overinflated ego and other self-serving characteristics. So there are two widely accepted forms of maladaptive narcissism, grandiose and vulnerable. Both are considered to be maladaptive because of the high dysregulation in the individual's self-esteem. Vulnerable narcissism is characterized by qualities of self-consciousness, insecurity, inadequacy, and anxiety, where grandiose narcissism is characterized by qualities of entitlement, callousness, and dominance. So now that we have an understanding for what narcissism is, we can circle back to our original question, what are its origins? It is well understood that parenting plays a fundamental role as the first socialization process a child has, and it sets the stage for how the child interacts later in their life, both with themselves and with others. Parents who do not adequately provide support in response to their child's needs may be playing a part in the impairment of the child's development of ego and perception of self. So the three parenting styles we are investigating are as follows. First, we have the authoritarian parent, who has strict rules, high standards of obedience, and harsh punishment. In this relationship where rules are set and unwavering, a child's independence and confidence is stifled, and they may struggle with developing their own skills, recognizing their own wants and feelings, and establishing their own ideals. Next, we have the authoritative parent, and they provide clear rules and standards. They equally weigh their child's perspective in decision-making. They provide fair discipline and promote the child's independence. The children that grow up under this parenting style are typically mature, socially responsible, and self-aware. They learn how to properly express themselves and communicate their needs to others. This helps them learn to establish healthy social relationships as well as promote a confident, healthy self-esteem. And last, we have the permissive parent who lovingly dotes on their children. They're very tolerant and forgiving to the point where their parenting is almost hands-off. The children make the rules, there are no set standards, and there's difficulty with discipline and punishment. This style fully caters to the children and puts parental guidance on the back burner, causing their children to be more immature and can cause unhealthy levels of self-regulation. Because of this complex relationship, I hypothesize that authoritarian and permissive parenting styles that are not fully supporting the child's needs will lead to impairment in the child's development of ego and self, and down the line, their narcissistic tendencies. I also hypothesize that qualities such as loudness and aggression, which have been associated with masculinity through socialized gender norms, will cause men to present with more outward grandiose narcissistic traits rather than be inward vulnerable. Additionally, qualities such as meekness and intuitive emotional expression, which have been associated with femininity through socialized gender norms, will cause women to present with more inward vulnerable narcissistic traits rather than the outward grandiose. So 220 undergraduate students from Keene participated in an online Qualtrics survey in two different study groups. The first was a pilot over the summer, and the second was a main study that took place in the fall. In the pilot, the narcissistic personality inventory, which I'm going to refer to throughout this presentation as the NPI, and the parental authority questionnaire, which I'll refer to as the PAQ, were used to measure narcissism and parental authority styles. After analysis of the pilot data and additional research was done on the literature, I found that the NPI was a more accurate measure of grandiose narcissism, and it tended to neglect the portions of vulnerable narcissism that I was really curious about. So because of this, the hypersensitive narcissism scale, the HSNS, was added to the main study to further outline the vulnerable narcissistic qualities. So a multiple linear regression model was run to determine if parental authority styles acted as a predictor for narcissism and to determine the strength of the relationship. In all of the statistically significant data found from the regressions, significance was only found across all genders and women because of the sample size. We only had 35 men and 7 non-binary individuals. So no significance was found using the NPI totals, but when controlling for the subscales, significance in entitlement was found in addition to vanity. Also, significance was found with the hypersensitive narcissism scale. So our first set of tables shows the NPI subscale data. Here we are only reporting significant predictors. However, all parenting subtypes were accounted for, all three of the authoritarian, authoritative, and permissive for the mother and father. So table 1, for all genders, about 9% of the variability in entitlement was due only to father's authoritarianism. So the overbearing father showed an increase in the grandiose narcissistic subtype of entitlement. And for women, about 14% of the variability in entitlement was due to mother's authoritativeness, the balanced mothers, father's authoritarianism, the overbearing fathers, and father's permissiveness, the overindulgent fathers. And all of those showed an increase for the grandiose narcissistic subtype of entitlement. And additionally, when fathers were authoritative, the balanced style, there were lower rates of entitlement seen in women. So going on down to table 2, we have our vanity regression. For all genders, approximately 6% of the variability was due only to mother's authoritarianism. So when mothers were overbearing, we were seeing higher rates of vanity across all genders. And then our table for the hypersensitive narcissism regression, for all genders, about 18% of the variability was due to father's authoritarianism and father's permissiveness, the overbearing and overindulgent parenting types, and those showed higher rates of vulnerable narcissism in all genders. And these same two predictors also showed higher rates of vulnerable narcissism in women, accounting for approximately 25% of the variability in vulnerable narcissistic qualities. So as previously mentioned, no significance was found in the regressions in men or non-binary individuals due to the small sample size. But because of my interest in seeing how these tendencies separated based off of gender, I looked into bivariate correlations to see if there was a relationship between variables, and significance was found there. So significance was found between the NPI subscales in each group, but here I'm only focusing on significance between subscales and parenting styles. So for men, mother's authoritarianism, the overbearing style, accounted for an increase in the variability of vanity, accounting for about 17% of that relationship. And for non-binary individuals, all the correlations found were in relation to exploitativeness. The higher rates of mother's permissiveness, the overindulgent style, showed a decrease in exploitativeness, accounting for about 80% of the variability. And mother's authoritarianism, the overbearing style, showed an increase in exploitativeness across non-binary individuals, accounting for 67% of the variability. And last, mother's authoritativeness, our balanced style, shows a decrease in variability, accounting for about 66%. And no significance in either grouping was found with the hypersensitive narcissism scale. So these results begin to show that parental attachment can influence narcissistic trait presentation in this sample, particularly with women and particularly within women and fathers' authoritarian and permissive styles. These are the styles that are either overbearing or overindulging the child, and they do not provide adequate support for the child's needs. So those findings showed correlation to both vulnerable narcissism and facets of grandiose narcissism. The only time that we saw negative correlations were with father's authoritativeness, which was the balanced style. And this supports the hypothesis that when a child's needs are being supported, we begin to see less narcissistic tendencies. And when looking at mother styles, the significance seen could begin to indicate that children of different genders have different types of attachment with their parents of same or opposite gender. And this could be an influential factor in attachment and therefore potential narcissistic trait presentation. For example, in the regression for women and all genders, there were positive correlations with mother's authoritarianism and vanity and mother's authoritativeness and entitlement, showing an increase in those aspects of grandiose narcissism. Those are the overbearing styles and the balanced styles of parenting. And in the bivariate correlations for men and non-binary individuals, all the significant relationships were seen with the mother styles. So authoritarianism, the overbearing style, was positively correlated with vanity in men, and in non-binary individuals, authoritarianism again was positively correlated, but with entitlement. And the permissive parenting, the overindulgent style, and authoritative parenting, the balanced style, were both negatively correlated, showing a decrease in entitlement. I'm sorry, not entitlement, in exploitativeness. So this could indicate that the mother and father's influence on their child have different roles, and the different forms of attachment with their children produce different outcomes in the child's narcissistic trait presentation. However, we would need to conduct more research on this to identify the relationships of different relationships with the children and their same or opposite gendered parents, and the relationship to narcissistic trait presentation. It is also difficult to make definitive statements about the trait presentation in the child across gender, since the sample size is made of predominantly women. So if I were to do this study over, the goal would be to sample randomly and more broadly to obtain more men and non-binary individuals for a more equal distribution of gender, so more concrete statements about gender and narcissistic trait presentation could be made. And additionally, I would perhaps investigate a different measure of grandiose narcissism with fewer subscales and a more reliable total score. But all in all, the results of the study begin to outline a relationship between parental attachment and narcissistic tendencies in young adults. And it has also outlined the deep complexities and multifaceted presentation of narcissism and narcissistic tendencies in young adults. So here are my references, and I would just like to take a moment to say a special thank you to Keene State College and the Center for Creative Inquiry for the CCI and SURF grants. And I would also like to say thank you to my research committee, Dr. Chioli, Dr. Welkowitz, and Dr. Wade, and a special thank you to Dr. Jennings. And this work would just not have been possible without any of them. And I just want to say thank you everyone for coming and listening to my presentation and everyone else's presentations. So I believe it's question time.
It is. And before we get to that, and there's Harlan, and we're going to put the rest of you up on Spotlight. I just want to make sure that you know how great those presentations were, and how much a Zoom presentation is always greeted with crickets at the end because of the microphone problem and everything like that. And I hope you were looking at the screen and seeing people applauding with their hands. These were wonderful presentations, and if we were in an auditorium, it would have been a loud and affirming response for each of you. Also, handing stuff off to each other, you did a very nice job. So thank you for both those things. We've got a bunch of questions, I think. I see a bunch of bubbles down there under the chat. And I thought maybe I would just hand it over to Harlan to see if you have any questions you want to start with, and maybe to the psych professors if they have things they want to jump in with.
Sure. Well, I'll ask one question to start, and it's actually the last question that Wes put in there. Also, we had the same thought, Katie, about your talk, which is you looked at fathers versus mothers, but did you think about the role of single parent households versus two parent households and what that might play?
Yeah, that's a great question. So because of just how complex the family structure is, I specified in my study that we are looking for whichever male figure or male identifying figure in your life had an influence over you the most as a child, and the same for a woman like parental guardian figure. So it was mostly on based on influence on the child instead of like the family like structure, if they were married or if they if you had two mothers or two fathers. We were mostly looking at the presentation of gender in guardian figures.
Okay, interesting. All right, so yeah, so it would be great if the psychology faculty, and there are some questions from others in the chat, but we can have some psychology faculty ask first, and then we'll get to those questions in a second.
Yeah.
So I want to echo what Michael Welsh has said, that these were all terrific. I can't remember all of them being so terrific in all the years I've been listening to these talks. So thank you to all of you. I'll limit myself just randomly to one question, but Vanessa, I was intrigued by this thing I had never heard of, a prolific academic. I'm curious about how you recruited subjects through this group and why you chose apparently some other group access rather than our own Keene State College students.
So the main reason I chose not to use Keene State College students is in all of the literature reviews I did. College students, yes, they use alcohol, yes, they use marijuana, but I was looking at more serious drugs like heroin, painkillers, things like that, which if students are using them, they're very unlikely to report to another student. So I wanted to use an outside website, which was Prolific Academic. Prolific Academic was great because all I had to do was submit the link from Qualtrics, which Qualtrics is a site I've worked with numerous times. So it made it very easy. Prolific Academic was very cool too, because I was able to select that I wanted male and females from North America, and I was able to say that I wanted them to have experience with substance use, which was like the key to my study.
So can I press a little harder on that? So is it do we have a subscription to it? How do they get subjects to actually answer the questions? Are they paid?
Yes, so the subjects are paid.
Okay.
They're paid, I believe they're paid per minute. So you put in the amount of questions you're asking them, and then you put in the amount of participants you're looking for, and then it gives you the price of what it will cost to submit your application there. And they're basically guaranteeing you that they can get that amount of people in your what you're looking for, like substance use and stuff like that, and they'll get it to you rather quickly. So when I submitted my stuff, I had it within like 72 hours. I had all 220 participants, and depending on like the size of your study kind of depends the price. So basically my entire grant went to my participants.
Sure. It's very interesting. So Harlan, are there others?
All right, yeah. So it looks like Wes had another question for Katie. So he was saying that how many distinct dimensions are subsumed in the 3 categories of parenting style? That he assumes it's a multi-dimensional space, but all the dimensions operate in similar ways, in comparable ways across the three styles.
Let me see if I understand the question before I answer it. Are you asking if the subtypes of parenting like directly correlate to the narcissism subtypes?
No, I'm actually stumbling at the starting line, as usual. I gather that there are dimensions that define each of the 3 parenting style: authoritarianism, authoritativeness, and permissiveness. And I don't know how many dimensions each one of those is built from, and are the same dimensions at work in all 3. With 3 categories, there's some multiple of 3 defining subdimensions.
I believe I understand.
So there's some kind of multivariate analysis that underlies each one of those 3.
Yeah.
And is it the same factors? Is your beta 1, beta 2, beta 3 the same for each of them?
I'm honestly not quite sure, but I believe that like there are overlaps in the different styles, and that parents don't necessarily fit one or the other. They can have aspects of each of them. I think that just for the parental authority questionnaire, they just brought it down to this level, and those 3 types didn't necessarily have subtypes in that scale, but that would be really interesting to investigate, like the subtypes within the parenting and the traits of the parents, and see like which one of those subtypes of the parenting subtypes are correlating to the narcissistic traits. I would love to do something like that. That'd be really
interesting. That's exactly where I was wondering where you were going to go. Or okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's see, I think I'm not sure if there are any other questions in the chat. So if there are other questions from the audience, now's a great time for them to be asked.
do we have time to ask each one of them this question? I think these experiences are transformative, and it would be really nice to hear everybody. You did a fabulous job, the four of you. It'd be nice to talk about how this research has changed you. What have you learned about yourself as a result of this work that you've done?
It's a great question. Yeah.
Don't all jump to answer first.
I'm going to say Grace is closest. She's on the left of my screen and I'm going left to right. So Grace, can you go first?
Sure. I mean, so I've worked in Dr. Harlan Fichtenholz's lab for 3 years. So I do have a little bit of research experience, but, trying to figure out I've always been able to work in the lab and deal with participants directly. So trying to figure out how to adapt to this whole COVID thing has been very interesting. So trying to figure out how to still collect data and do something that I find interesting was difficult, but it was fun and like a learning experience for sure. So, I mean, I feel like that's how it's impacted me. So.
Sure. We can go to my right from there, or anybody else can jump in. The next person is actually Katelyn on my screen.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Jennings has asked me this question a couple times, and she's heard my answer a few times. This was my first research experience, and I came into it not quite knowing what to expect, and I really wasn't ready to do a bunch of statistics because I don't really have a math brain, and I came out of it like really enjoying it, and now I enjoy like a good table and some hearty numbers. And I also learned that a lot of research, the most difficult parts aren't necessarily the parts that you expect them to be. Sometimes it's emailing files to yourself and losing your data and rerunning things. And I also just learned that this is something that I really enjoy. And I started out really wanting to go into forensic psychology, which is sort of what inspired my work. But I really am interested in transpersonal psychology now, and I'd really like to continue and do dream studies in the future. So hopefully this is an experience that I can take and apply to my future career. So it's been very, very self-transformative. I learned many things.
Terrific. Megan's next on my screen, and then Vanessa.
All right, so I guess kind of like Grace, I've been in Dr. Fichtenholz's lab for a while now, so I've had quite a bit of experience doing human research type studies and whatnot. The only difference for me was the fact that I had to completely scrap my original project going in. I had it wasn't completely different. It was honestly altered from what I have presented for you guys. Going in, I wanted to look at the correlational relationship between the neuropeptide Y and stress reactivity and how that affects resiliency and trauma. But because of COVID-19, and we would have had to get a deactivating viral agent for the samples. So it just started going downhill because of COVID. So I guess that would be a really cool direction to go in the future. But yeah, this definitely was eye-opening in terms of, I guess my own resiliency, because we had to completely change courses, and I had to learn how to program some code and all of that kind of stuff. So it definitely made me think and challenged me in ways I didn't expect to be challenged. So
Terrific. Great answer. Vanessa.
So I've worked in Dr. Scholey's Hope Lab since like my first week freshman year. So I've like always been involved in research and really loved it. And like the really great thing about working with Dr. Scholey is that he always included some type of like substance use or something into his studies that were like a direct interest of mine. But like really getting to do my own study from start to finish was like, it was amazing. I really love research, and like I think that this really helped me say like for sure that this is the career path that I want to do, because I always have thought it, but like doing this project from start to finish, doing all the literature reviews and then writing that paper, it really like helped me confirm that in my head, that this is what I want to do.
Terrific. Other questions?
Michael, I just wanted to say to all of them that, we all talk, the faculty talk, and, we all came originally from first tier, R01 type places, all of us, and we come to a smaller state college. And these presentations are at the level of master's degree students working at first tier schools. So, and this is my way of encouraging you to all pursue those academic pursuits.
Yeah, I will second that. I went to a Big Ten school and I took a psych class, and as part of the psych class, I had to be a subject for one of the experiments, and it was not students that were conducting it. It was professors and PhD students, and I think it's a really important experience for all your peers to be involved in research that you're designing and guiding. And I have to say, if I were to be a subject for any of the research projects that I saw today, the one I'd like the least is being asked to count backwards from 2043 by 17s. I think that sounds miserable.
Oh, hey, Michael, speaking of going backwards, if we could pick up a question in the chat. I see our new faculty member, Shaylee Woodard, has a question. We don't want to let that slide.
Yeah, so if there's time, then this will probably be our last question. But so our new faculty member who's joining us in August, Dr. Woodard, for you, Grace. She's saying is, did you randomize the pictures that were presented to participants so that they weren't, the same type wasn't always on the same side? If people always ranked beach destinations more desirable and it was always on the left, might that have caused the bias?
Great question. So there were, if you want to be specific about the beach, so there were multiple beach pictures, not necessarily the same beach. So some of them might have been on the left or right, but the set, like if it was a beach and a city, they would be the same regardless, if that answers your question.
Sure. So was your study set up in a way that they were displayed randomly on the left or right side, or did the same pictures always show up on the same side for all the participants?
The same pictures were presented on the same side for all the participants, but the order was randomized.
Gotcha. Okay.
The categories might be different though. So like there were beach pictures on the left and beach pictures on the right. It's just
right.
The pairs were the same for each person. Yeah.
I had a question for Grace too, whether there was any research you looked at in terms of, I know there's been where they have people, if you're looking at a fixation point and images on the left side are going to the right visual field and being processed more on the right, is there more of an emotional response to images on the left than on the right?
I did not read anything about that, but that is interesting. I'd be curious to look more into that. But I didn't read anything about that.
Yeah, because I know there is with faces, when they give people chimeric faces and that there's different responses to the emotion from a face presented in the left visual field.
Mm-hmm.
Which might reflect some of that. I don't know.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I'd be curious to see if like the faces were different from something like, vacation destinations. So.
Yeah.
Hey, Susan, I wonder similarly, if someone loses their hearing in one ear, okay, that's me. I lost my hearing in my left ear. Are we then processing emotional information differently? It looks like Harlan has a response to that. No?
I don't know about that for auditory information, but that's different than
That's
say
cross,
visual.
though, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's crossover. Yeah, there's crossover for all of it, but there's still a bias in the hemispheres. So.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that's about the time we have, right, Mike?
Yep. And so Harlan, do you have any last words for your?
All I just want to say is I can't agree more with what a lot of other people have said, which is you guys all did a great job. And I've seen how hard all of you have worked for the past year and a half developing and executing these projects. And you guys should be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished and what you've done and what I'm sure you're going to do in 2 weeks when you're no longer here. So we're going to miss you all quite a bit.
Right. So congratulations, you guys. And just by way of wrapping up, I'll thank everyone for showing up tonight. I'll thank all the students for signing up and showing up so regularly and being a good base of the audience. I'll remind you about your paper. And one last thing for students and everyone else, this is our last of the seminars for the semester, but it's not the last. We'll be back in the fall with another collection of talks that I hope are as good as the ones we saw this spring. So thank you very much, and we'll see you hopefully in the fall. Night.